everyone, my name's Chris, and I'm here to talk to you about Hugo shortcodes for the win. So let's get to it. So Hugo shortcodes for the win. Little bit about me first. I'm a Twitch programming streamer. I got all dressed up for this. I wear fancy hoodies on stream all the time. I also have a Twitter and a GitHub. Feel free to follow there. I'm somewhat senior software developer. That's just kind of fun to say. And, I'm interested in DevRel, dev advocacy. So if anyone's looking for a DevRel or dev advocate, let me know. And I loved snowboard. It's basically my favorite thing besides streaming, or vice versa. Not sure yet. My main goal on stream is to build things, not necessarily teaching. And I work with Node, Go, Rust, Elixir. I'm not picky about languages at all, or frameworks, etc. React, any of that. I use all of it. I don't care. So to start things off correctly, we're going to have some jokes. And they're going to be a bit, it's a Hugo presentation. So Hugo Weaving is going to be reacting to these in GIF form. Let's just get to it. I think my white noise machine is broken. It keeps making static. And Hugo Weaving is not happy about it. We got his attention. So, we're talking about shortcodes for Go. It is one of the ways of shortcodes for Hugo, and it's one of the ways of extending Hugo. There's modules and there's shortcodes. Modules are pretty interesting. They use the Go module format and everything. Most commands require Go greater than 1.12 because of that. We're not going to be digging too much into modules today. Our biggest concern are shortcodes. So think about them like HTML custom elements. They're only usable in content files. So if you need to do something inside of like a template file, you're going to have to create a partial template. And we didn't really dig into that. Here you see two different kinds of shortcodes, and we'll dig into what makes them different here in a bit, but we can see that there's the percent symbol for this MD shortcode. And then we can see the highlight one with the bracket here. So highlight is a different kind of shortcode. They do different things, just slightly different. We'll dig into that. But just, you can take all of your code that you want to annotate as some Go code, and you can just throw it into this highlighted thing that will create the, the syntax highlighting, the wrapping around it using a pre and a code element, and it's just really useful. So, time for another joke. For the first time in my life, I can walk past a balloon and it doesn't stick to me. I'm absolutely ecstatic. And that one was so good, we actually made Hugo Weaving break character as Elrond. I take that as a compliment. So, digging into those shortcodes, right? We see the percent symbol, we see the angle brackets. The percent symbol means that the inner content's still going to be parsed inside of your content. So if there's markdown inside of it, it's going to be parsed as markdown still. With the angle bracket, it's not going to do that. So you can have any symbol that markdown is caring about, such as the asterisk or underscores or hash symbols, octothorpes. You can have those, and it will just render them as they are because it's not parsing it as markdown. So that's quite useful. For what I'm going to be showing off today, I use the angle bracket syntax because I don't even take in any content, so there's nothing to parse. There's a couple built-in shortcodes that are pretty useful, pretty interesting, and kind of like hint at what you can do with a shortcode. So there's figure for an annotated image with a caption and stuff. There's gist to load a GitHub gist, right? The little iframe thing they give you or whatever. There's highlight that we just saw for syntax highlighting snippets of code. And then we even see some social stuff where you can embed an Instagram post, a tweet, a Vimeo video, a YouTube video just right into your blog post using a very simple shortcode syntax. So it's pretty nice. It's a good way of just saving you from having too much junk in there and copying and pasting all of the stuff from the embed codes and all that. You can just link to the tags that you need, the ID, etc. We're going to be talking about custom shortcodes. So one that you want to make yourself. And there's some interesting stuff about them. There's positional and named parameters. In that highlight one we saw, that was a positional parameter. So it's going to know that that's the first param, and you're going to look up that param by that positional. I tend to prefer using the named parameters just because the order doesn't matter anymore. So it's just a little cleaner to manipulate and do everything that you're trying to do with the shortcode. Here's an example one that they have in their docs here at Go Hugo templates / shortcode templates. And it's very simple, right? We just do the angle bracket, do year, and we can see that it's self-closing, so we don't have to have anything inside it. And from there, it's just going to run this code inside of a Go template. So it's going to do now.format, and then the format string. For people who are less familiar with Go's format strings, this is just saying give us the year of now. This is just very specific to how Go does its format strings. So something to keep in mind. This is not just some arbitrary year. This is very specific. It's something you have to do if you want to get the current year from some now timestamp type object. It's now time for another joke. I want to try and space these out a bit. A sweater I bought was picking up static electricity, so I returned it to the store. They gave me another one free of charge. And that one's pretty good. He's actually upset that he almost liked that one. I'm really happy with that. That one's good. Let's dig into what my shortcode actually does. So I called it Hugo Image. It's inspired by Gatsby Image. If you haven't heard of Gatsby Image, it's a plugin for Gatsby. Gatsby is a static site generator built on top of React. Gatsby Image does some really good image placeholder stuff for you, and it allows you to like resize the final image, and it has a lot of functionality built into it. One caveat is it doesn't do remote images. It needs them sourced locally. That's something that we can support with Hugo just fine, and I can support in another plugin I've made for another static site generator as well. So it's kind of interesting just the limitations of some of these things. The main gist is it creates a placeholder image, and then it can use the blur up technique or a pixelated technique to just have that be the image, and then we lazy load the image in afterwards. So there's a link to it. It's a very simple shortcode. It involves, like, to install it, you just have to copy and paste things around. I'd like to figure out a better way of, deploying that and shipping it. But for now, it's still a good proof of concept. So why do we want to do this kind of stuff for images, right? Why would we want to load a placeholder image and then lazy load in the image? Well, the lazy placeholder image loads in way quicker, so you're going to have faster page loads. There's less initial data over the wire for the user, especially if we're lazy loading things in. If the user doesn't scroll to it, we don't have to load the image, and we're saving the user bandwidth that way. And yes, we're using intersection observer for this. You could theoretically use the new loading equals lazy attribute on images. It's supported in all major browsers now, but it's not quite the same thing. Basically, if you just use loading equals lazy, you're not going to have a placeholder, so you're going to end up creating some layout shift. And that layout shift is a very bad user experience. I think we all know websites we've been on where we're just trying to maybe like click a link or get to some page, and as the page is loading in, all the ads and stuff start popping and jumping around, and the thing you thought you were going to click became some ad. Do we think some of them are doing it on purpose? Probably, but it's a bad user experience. So all of this is about improving the user's experience of wherever you want to have your content, your Hugo blog, etc. Now, one thing I wanted to point out, I almost forgot, is could I use loading lazy under the hood instead of intersection observer? I could still load a placeholder, and then my large image could be loading lazy, and that's not a bad idea. It's just, this is the pattern I'm familiar with from another plugin I've written, so it was very easy to port the code over. So loading lazy might be the future and might be a good, easy way of just, swapping out the intersection observer logic, and it'll actually cut down on a bunch of our JS logic that we have to do. So what would the usage of Hugo Image actually look like? We can see 3 different types. So first, we see a remote image. Very easy, we just pass source, and it notices that it's remote just simply by starting with HTTP or HTTPS. We can also see that there are images for local, or there's support for local images. So if you have something in your global assets folder, you would end up specifying resource type global. I figured this should be an edge case simply because when you're making blog posts, etc., are you actually going to be having an image that you're going to be reusing on multiple pages? If you are, you put it in global. But if it's something that's unique to that blog post, well, yeah, you just want to do a content image instead. And that page resource just lives right next to the markdown that you have in the same folder. So yes, you get to actually like locate these things where it makes the most sense. It can get really heavy once you have 1,000 images in your assets folder. And instead, you could have them scope to the blog post that actually uses them. There's a bit of configuration. We saw the source attribute pass, and that's the only one that's required. The rest we have defaults that we can like rely upon, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff we can do. So here, pixel height, pixel width. This helps us prevent the page shifting. So if we don't pass some values, it's going to use the actual image height that the image we're trying to lazy load in is. If you wanted it to be smaller, you have to pass a pixel height and width. Kind of makes sense. There's some cases where in a blog post you might want to have 10 of these next to each other. Totally. No big deal. We can support that. There's a couple other configurations. These are optional mainly because we coerce a sensible default from the options available. So blurred is the default for preloaders, and page is the default for resource type. And we went into why page is the default there because it just makes more sense when you're doing a blog post or something. So some more info. I linked to Hugo image again, a little bit on the roadmap. I want to figure out a way to include the style and script snippets that we're going to be seeing programmatically without the user having to like link to them on their own. But for now, you just copy and paste a CSS file and a JS file into the right place, link them in your head of your main layout, and it'll just kick in for any image on the page. I'd also like to look into how do we do the render hook process. So when we're doing our markdown parsing, there's each like element within the markdown. So images, headings, all sorts of stuff. We can hook into those render hooks and actually override how it processes it into the resulting HTML. So we could hook into that image function or callback and do our Hugo image magic. I didn't do that for this, and it's a little out of scope because it's more than just a shortcode at that point. And I believe I'd have to deal with the whole partial template stuff because it's no longer a content file. So right now, we're just digging into shortcodes, how we do them in content, and that's our main scope. So I know, that was a bunch of junk there. We're going to have a bunch of junk more, but we're going to have another joke. What do you call an electric car that isn't moving? Static. I know, that was one of the worst ones, and we're actually making Hugo weaving mad now. So real quick, we see this is where the file lives. This is the main bulk of what's happening using Go templating syntax and processing the images and all that stuff. And it's actually this right here, that name, is what the shortcode is actually going to become. So you name that file whatever you want your shortcode to be. We wanted Hugo image, so that determines the shortcode. Let's actually look into the contents here of this, and we start off with a couple constants. This is mainly to prevent too many magic strings and me possibly misspelling something and having to figure out where that bug is for too long. So I would recommend this type of process, at least if you're going to be making your own shortcodes with configurable stuff and defaults and all that. From there, we need to get the props from the shortcode. And remember, source is the only one that's required. All of these others we're going to be coercing defaults from, but we still need to load in the prop if it's there. So once again, we're just doing .get. This is going to be taking the context of the page that we're looking at, and we can grab that from the, not the page, sorry. It grabs it from the shortcode that we're looking at. So you can have multiple shortcodes. They all have their own scope of .get, and we can grab these values. When we want to coerce the defaults, this is the way I did it. I have a couple different ways you're seeing here. I use the with syntax in one spot. I'm doing an if equals in another. But for the most part, you just need to have your default and then check to see if your configuration is different from it. So pretty simple. If someone passes preloader type, we do this. One nice part about this later syntax is we check if it's actually equal to the other thing, and we just set it equal to the other thing. So it starts out as page, and then we just check if they've made it global, and we set it to global. Technically, this here with the with syntax allows the user to pass a value that we might not support. And we want to maybe guard against that at some point. So I might want to refactor that. At this point, hey, we need to actually fetch the image to see how big it is, to process it into the preloader that we needed, all of that. And this is where, we take in whether it's a global resource or not, and then grab the image a certain way. And we also just check, well, if it starts with HTTP, we grab the image this way. And we can do this piping to make things just a little cleaner. So we're going to be doing our full-size image path is the raw image source. Then from there, we check if raw image source starts with HTTP. And from there, we create this image. This image is then going to, get grabbed via go HTTP, just fetching. But then if it's not starting with that as the source, we want to grab either the global resource, and that is resources.get, or the page resource, which takes in the page's context. So that's where this is pretty important. This is passed into the shortcodes context as .page, and then that's where we do this get match that grabs something from that local folder. And then finally, after we've grabbed this image, we need to get the local permalink. So Hugo's going to go grab all of these, and then we get just a link that we can embed it to, and it's going to, copy things over as we need it. We need that image, though, to load things in later. So now, we process the image into the preloader. So this last part, we were just grabbing the image that we had something to manipulate. Now we need to manipulate it. So first off, we just say it's equal to the image, and then we check if our preloader is equal to any of these. Technically, if someone passed a bad preloader type to us, we might fail out here. So this is where I could make this more robust. I need to improve it just a bit. But we can see that with the blurred type, I just take the image, resize it down to 40 pixels on the X, and then later on the CSS, we're going to make it bigger to whatever size the original image is, and then apply a CSS blur to it. So we're not actually blurring anything using our image processing, but we make it smaller and then use client-side logic to just blur it. That way, our blur isn't encoded into the image. That's better because we can make the image any size we want, and the CSS blur is going to take care of that. So we're not going to see a pixelated blur. That would be weird. And then here we see another type. This is pixelated, and this ships with Hugo. Now, one thing I might have missed earlier is if I wanted to have something other than blurred or pixelated, I'd have to actually fork Hugo and add the function myself to do this processing. Because Hugo's a compiled thing, we'd have to compile our other functionality into, which is interesting, right? But we could theoretically get POTrace or Squib or a bunch of other SVG kind of processing tools involved in this, and yeah, it would just be a fork and our own compilation at that point. So now we need to size the image. If we passed a pixel width, then we're going to set width to this value. We're going to be using this later for the CSS of things, just to lay it out cleaner. But yeah, we just need to make sure that we're assigning a sensible default from the image that we parsed. And then finally, we're to the meat of how this whole thing works. We end up having this top level Hugo image wrapper. It's going to be position relative. And then here we have our dynamic style values that we just inject at this point. Pretty simple and straightforward. Inside of that, we have these relatively positioned images that are going to take up the full size of the parent, and they just overlay each other. So one doesn't show by default. That's the full size image, and we don't even have a proper source set on it. And then here is our placeholder, and we check, well, should we be applying the blur if our type is blur? So anyone familiar with Go templating should be pretty familiar with what we're doing here. Nothing too crazy, right? But one thing to remember is we need our full-size image path. That's where we did that coercion earlier. We need that here as part of our data full-size source. And we can then, as our JavaScript does the intersection observer stuff, load in the image. We want to make sure that we have source empty here because we don't want to load the image until we scroll to it. So then finally, here's some styling. We kind of went over the relative, the absolute, the default opacity 0 on our full-size image so that we can fade it in, and the fade should be transitioned so that it's nice and clean and fast. And then here we have our blur conditionally applied later, like earlier, and we just do a CSS blur. Not a big deal. And then Hugo image loaded is a class that we add on later. Finally, the scripting does most of our magic. And this is more just informational. If you ever want to make your own version of this type of lazy loaded image, it's pretty simple. You just attach or create an intersection observer, and we're going to loop over all entries. So as we loop over entries, we can check, is it intersecting? Does it contain our already loaded? If so, then we just don't need to process it again. And if everything's okay, we start hopping in and we grab the full-size image elements that we can manipulate. From there, we add an event listener, load, and once it's loaded, we just say Hugo image loaded, we give it that class, and that's going to fade it in. Finally, we have our error listener. We could do that if we wanted some client-side logic, something that just maybe did a fallback of some kind. For the most part, though, if there's no image, it's not going to matter. It's not going to load our thing into place because load here isn't going to fire. Error is instead. And then finally, with these event listeners attached, we can set the source to what we expect. It's going to go load that source and either fire, load, or error. So we need to make sure we're grabbing that get attribute. At the very end of it, right, this is for our intersection observers config, that's fine. And then here, we need to make sure that we are actually just querying for all of the images on the page, and we just tell the observer to observe them. So there's a bit of like two parts to this. If we just set up the intersection observer, but didn't tell it to observe anything, nothing would happen. Whew, that was a bunch. I know I just overloaded you with a bunch of functionality stuff that you probably didn't even necessarily care about. This was about making shortcodes, but kind of showing like how you can have a bunch of this stuff and glue it together for the user for a better experience. So now time for another joke. I went to pick up my son the other day, and there was a static shock. I realized it's true what they say. Having kids grounds you. And I'm pretty sure at this point, Hugo Weaving's trying to figure out where I live to hurt me. It's okay. I get it. So as we're kind of wrapping up, I mentioned I'm a Twitch streamer. You know, I hope you enjoyed what I was talking about there. I hope you guys are actually, you know, empowered to make your own shortcodes now. But there's other Twitch streamers here on, there's other streamers here on Twitch that use Go. So there's the Primogen. He's very entertaining. You're not going to be able to put him on as background noise for work because you're going to be distracted too much. There's TeejDev, MelkyDev, Bash Bunny, Large Databank, RWX Rob, and the Alt F4 stream. They all do Go in some capacity. They don't all use Go all the time. I think the main all-the-time users are Bash Bunny and Large Databank, and possibly RWX Rob. But still, I recommend all their streams. They're all just awesome people. Here are some citations. This is the important part. This is where all of the inspiration for this came from. This is where, you know, we can see how Gatsby Image is a plugin there. But the early inspiration mainly is this engineering post from Facebook from ages ago. I hope it still works, actually, because they did their rebranding, but it should be fine. It goes into how they needed to make sure they squeezed it into 200 bytes or something so that they could squeeze it into the initial GraphQL response that they were getting on an Android app. And this was going to do your cover photo. They would do the blur up technique, so they'd resize it down real small, resize it back up on the client, blur it, and then lazy load in the larger image. They needed to make it 200 bytes to squeeze it into a reasonable size for the GraphQL payload. So they go through a whole bunch of ways how they got it actually smaller and smaller. For the most part, I haven't seen the blurred placeholders be bigger than like 1 kilobyte. So it's not a huge deal, but still pretty interesting. From here, we see stuff like placeholder techniques for JM Perez. This is an older blog post in which he goes into showing like PO trace, which does a nice like traced and filled SVG. There's another thing called Squib, which does like shapes, overlays them, and sees it as long as it like matches enough, you get like a cool artistic triangle-based placeholder. Very interesting stuff. And there's even a few others, like a weird like line tracing one that animates. Very cool techniques. I think it's worth checking out to give you inspiration for maybe some custom placeholder you want. Like we said, there was Gatsby Image. That was the main inspiration for me, because if a static site generator like Gatsby can do it, why can't other static site generators? And then shameless plug, I made Scully image for Scully. Scully is a static site generator for Angular in the same way that Gatsby is a static site generator for React. So yeah, I wanted to see if I could do it for Hugo. I had done Scully image already, and the Hugo image thing just seemed kind of fun, right? So we wanted to see if we could do it and how we could do it, and Shortcodes seemed like the quickest and easiest way. So here we go. Last joke of the bit. Hope you like it. This one's my favorite. What did Gandalf say to Elrond as he watched him make a basket? There Hugo weaving again. And Hugo actually likes that one. Hugo weaving is enthused. So, yeah, maybe he doesn't want to hurt us anymore. Way better. So thank you for letting me give this talk. This was super fun. Just really fun putting the slides together, putting like the learning into how shortcodes work with Hugo. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Thanks.